Fort Bridger, Wyoming. This is one of very few places I used to be able to say that I've been to that Sonja hasn't been to. Of course, now that I took her there, I can't say that anymore. First time I was here, I was 12 years old, traveling with family back to Iowa for a family reunion. When I was a little kid, I was enthralled by mountain men, the Pony Express riders, cowboys, Indians, the whole thing. I just loved old westerns, kind of what I grew up on. So coming here as a 12-year-old, it was just super fascinating to me. It was fun to come back now, decades later. Fort Bridger is named after Jim Bridger. Jim Bridger and a partner, Louis Vasquez, established a fort here in 1843. Back in that time, it was all wooden cabins with a wooden fence around it. And it was just kind of an Indian stop. It was also part of the Oregon Trail. When the Oregon Trail started going through, they went right by Fort Bridger. It was an interesting crossroads for the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Pony Express, Transcontinental Railroad, and eventually even the Lincoln Highway. One of the neat things about this fort, and a lot of the things here at the fort, is they are original buildings, original wagon, of course the cover for the wagon. It's not original, but a lot of the stuff here is original buildings. Of course, it wasn't a big army fort initially. In fact, the Mormon Pioneer Company arrived in July of 1847. And they didn't care too much for Fort Bridger, as they felt the prices were way too high, and they disagreed with some of the business practices. In 1853, a group of armed Mormons went to the fort, kind of took the fort over. Bridger and Vasquez had left prior to that, so there was no confrontation. After the Mormons took it over, they built a stone wall around the fort. Interestingly enough, Jim Bridger came back in 1855, and the Mormons offered to buy the fort from him, the land, and a deal was eventually struck up. It wasn't until 1857 that the U.S. Army came in. And a lot of these buildings are from that time, 1857 and beyond. Thornburg the dog was kind of an interesting story. I actually remembered this from when I was there at 12 years old. He was kind of a stray dog that was adopted by the servicemen assigned to the fort, and became kind of the family pet. This is a replica of the original Fort Bridger with its wooden stockades and wooden buildings. Interestingly enough, they've been doing some excavation behind the museum, which is an old barracks that you'll see in a little bit, and they found some of the original Mormon wall. And with all the witness accounts and diaries and other documents they have, Mormons basically took down the wooden stockade wall and built the stone wall in its place. So they have a pretty good idea of where the original fort was, and it wasn't too far from this location where they built the replica. Just a little bit further to the south. You can see some of the old footings from the old buildings there to the left. Yeah, when the Army came in 1857, it was during what they were phrasing the Utah War. The Mormons heard they were coming, and in response, they actually burned the fort that was there when they knew that the Army was coming. When the Army arrived, they actually set up camp to the south of this fort for the initial winter, and then they moved up and rebuilt the fort in 1858. Here's some of the old Mormon wall that they found. And again, with the knowledge of that the Mormons built that wall over the wooden stockade walls of the original fort, they can show that this was the original fort location. Later, after the Army had built the fort up, William Carter came in and took over operations for supplies and things like that. The fort was used through the Civil War, and then after that, it was closed down temporarily, but it was reopened in 1880. And it's behind this old barracks, which is also now the museum, that the original Mormon wall has been uncovered. They kept the fort open until approximately 1890, and then it was closed for good. The museum was a good museum, lots of interesting displays of the history of the area, from the American Indian to Bridger. Here they even claim to have a saddle from Butch Cassidy. We enjoyed walking through the museum and seeing what it had on display. Interesting history in this area. This map supposedly was drawn out by Jim Bridger from memory. But you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, because he was also known to be a really good storyteller and had a story for just about everything. I have to say, even as an adult, I'm still fascinated with the Old West. And of course, it was nice to see some of the Lincoln Highway memorabilia and history, as well as this was one of the original locations and stops of the Lincoln Highway. It was also kind of neat walking around. We saw a moose sign while we were wandering the grounds. And they do occasionally have moose come into the fort area. Normally just in the winter when there's a lot of snow up in the mountains, but they do get a moose or two down here in the fort. After the fort closed down in 1890, several buildings were dismantled and taken into neighboring communities and put back together. This is one of those buildings. I believe it was 1978, 77, 78, I think, is when a deal was struck up to purchase this building from its current owners and move it back to the fort where it had been. And this would have been the commanding officer's quarters for the fort. It's kind of neat as you walk through. They have glass doors on all the rooms with displays. So even we were literally there the day they opened for the season, but they still don't have a lot of things open in the summertime. They also have role players, and I believe they open some of these doors so you can walk through when there's people there to kind of keep an eye on things. But it's nice that they have so many doors with glass windows that you can see in. So even when it's not completely open with volunteers and other employees, you can still look through and get a really good view of the house and what it would have been like. It's also kind of neat that they found this building, knew what it was, and was able to purchase it and bring it back to the fort. This building was not here when I was 12, but it's another one they found out in the community and purchased and brought back and put together here where it would have been. And from talking to some of the rangers, there's several other buildings they know of that used to be on the fort, and there is work in progress now trying to repurchase those buildings to bring them back to the fort side. This is one of the original Army buildings built in 1858 when the Army first moved in. Kind of a funny side note was one of the original military service members that was stationed here at the fort after the fort was closed down permanently in 1890 actually came back and lived in this building for quite some time, into the 1900s if I remember correctly. And this is an original building to the fort side. Eventually, the state of Wyoming named this a historical landmark and museum in 1933. It's been a state park ever since. Always kind of neat to see original photographs of the area. Maybe that's the same building too, I don't know. There was actually a row of these buildings originally, but this is the only one that survived. And these are original old Lincoln Highway motel with the motel office. Lincoln Highway was the first cross-country road. It predates Route 66. Interesting history, but that's for another time. Kind of interesting that they had little covered areas, I'm guessing for parking, next to the very, very small, simple rooms they had. Definitely not much to them, but a place to stay the night. We sure enjoyed our visit to Fort Bridger, and I hope you enjoyed sharing it with us. Thanks for watching.